For 7 long years, I'd quietly played the obedient wife, accepting their subtle insults, signing away my independence, and convincing myself that Andrew was my savior. But 2 hours before this dinner, while searching through a hidden safe in our private study for a missing deed, I found an official document that destroyed every single truth I had ever believed about my life. Harrison had not died in that mountain accident, and the man sleeping in my bed every night was living a lie built on a dark, calculated crime. When Andrew raised his crystal glass to toast 10 years of our flawless marriage, praising my complete devotion before his ruthless family and influential board members, I looked directly into his eyes and called him Harrison. The grand dining room fell into an absolute suffocating silence, as if every person at that table had forgotten how to breathe. My mother-in-law dropped her wine glass, sending crimson liquid splashing across the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. Andrew's fake smile shattered instantly, replaced by a flash of sheer terror that proved I had struck the exact nerve I intended to target. They all believed it was a humiliating slip of the tongue, a tragic mistake born from emotional exhaustion or early memory loss. Andrew quickly laughed it off, wrapping a tight, possessive arm around my waist, while reassuring our guests that I had simply been overworked lately. But as his fingers dug painfully into my hip under the table, whispering that I needed to watch my tongue, I felt no regret whatsoever. I had not misspoken, nor had I lost my mind. Harrison was the name of Andrew's older brother, the man who had supposedly died in a tragic mountain accident 7 years ago, leaving Andrew to inherit the entire family empire and take his place beside me. Looking at Andrew's trembling hands as he poured himself another drink, I realized the terrifying game had officially begun. They thought I was a fragile woman cracking under pressure, completely unaware that I now held the key to their destruction. If they knew what else I had discovered inside that safe, they would never let me walk out of this house alive. To understand the exact depth of the trap I had been living in for nearly a decade, you have to go back to the darkest, most terrifying period of my life. My father had devoted 40 years to building a mid-sized, highly respected commercial freight logistics firm in Savannah, Georgia. We were not multi-billionaires like the notorious Vance family, but we were financially stable, completely debt-free, and held an unblemished reputation throughout the maritime transport industry. My father worked tireless hours on the docks, instilling in me a deep pride in our hard-earned independence. Under his careful guidance, I pursued a degree in corporate administration and supply chain law, learning how to examine complex maritime leases, analyze port manifest logs, and navigate the intricate legal frameworks of international shipping contracts long before I ever set foot in a corporate boardroom. Everything we had built vanished into thin air over the course of 3 horrific weeks during my final semester at the university. It began with an unprecedented, highly suspicious disaster at our main riverfront terminal. A massive, high-value shipment of heavy industrial manufacturing equipment disappeared off our loading docks overnight without a single alarm sounding or a camera capturing the theft. Before our legal team could even process the loss, a cascade of catastrophic events struck our family simultaneously. Our insurance provider unexpectedly canceled our liability coverage, citing an obscure hidden clause regarding alleged internal security negligence. Crucial port operating licenses were abruptly suspended by municipal oversight committees. Long-standing international clients filed multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuits, and organized union labor strikes immobilized our entire fleet of trucks. The crushing stress proved utterly fatal for my father. During a frantic late-night meeting with aggressive bank auditors, he suffered a massive, debilitating stroke that left him paralyzed on his left side and entirely unable to speak. At just 24 years old, I found myself drowning in millions of dollars of sudden corporate debt, surrounded by predatory creditors, and entirely alone in the world with a dying father whose medical bills were escalating by thousands of dollars every single day. That was the precise moment Andrew Vance entered our lives, appearing like a shining beacon of hope amid absolute ruin. The Vance family owned Vance Maritime Global, a massive, multi-billion-dollar shipping conglomerate that held near monopolistic control over major commercial ports along the entire eastern seaboard. Andrew was the charming, 30-year-old younger son of the family, presenting himself to the local press as a warm, community-minded executive who cared deeply about local business stability. He arrived at my father's hospital room with a team of top-tier medical specialists, offering to cover every cent of my father's intensive rehabilitation care. Andrew sat beside me in those cold, sterile hospital corridors night after night, listening patiently as I cried, wiping away my tears and reassuring me that I no longer had to bear the crushing weight of the world on my shoulders. He brought in his family's elite legal counsel to shield my father from aggressive bank foreclosures and presented a comprehensive corporate merger proposal. The agreement stipulated that Vance Maritime Global would absorb our struggling firm, settle all outstanding creditor claims, and secure our valuable deepwater port terminal licenses within a protected joint venture. Exhausted, emotionally broken, and desperately seeking to save my father's life, I trusted Andrew completely. I signed every legal document he placed before me without questioning a single line, willingly surrendering our independent corporate assets into his hands. Within 12 months of the merger, my father passed away peacefully in his sleep, never regaining his speech. Only 3 months after his funeral, Andrew proposed to me under the sprawling oak trees of the Vance family's private coastal estate. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was marrying a noble, compassionate man who had rescued me from absolute financial and personal destruction out of pure, unconditional love. However, entering the inner circle of the Vance family quickly turned into a cold, psychological nightmare. Andrew's mother, Victoria Vance, ruled the family estate with an iron fist and a cruel, snobbish arrogance. From the very day of our wedding, she made it her personal mission to ensure I knew my place as a penniless charity case. At exclusive high society charity galas, private country club luncheons, and family dinners, Victoria routinely dropped passive-aggressive remarks about my humble background, loudly reminding influential guests how exceptionally generous Andrew had been to pick up a ruined girl from financial rock bottom. She treated my father's legacy with utter contempt, dismissing my education and frequently reminding me that my sole function in the family was to be a quiet, attractive, and obedient trophy wife. Whenever I attempted to discuss returning to corporate work, joining the board of directors, or simply reviewing the ongoing operational performance of my father's former riverfront port terminals, Andrew would immediately change the subject. He would gently wrap his arms around me, kiss my forehead, and speak to me in a soothing, condescending tone, telling me that managing corporate stress was far too dangerous for my fragile emotional health. He urged me to focus on home decor, charity committees, and hosting dinner parties, promising that he was handling every financial detail to protect our long-term security. For 7 long years, I swallowed my pride, endured Victoria's subtle cruelty, and forced myself to accept the gilded cage they had constructed around me. I convinced myself that my discomfort was a small price to pay for the safety, stability, and legal protection Andrew had provided during the worst crisis of my life. I became the perfect, docile corporate wife, organizing flawless charity auctions, keeping our estate running seamlessly, and maintaining a gentle, quiet smile whenever high-powered business executives praised the Vance family in my presence. The first hairline crack in this elaborate illusion appeared approximately 8 months ago during a routine property tax audit. While organizing old filing cabinets in our estate's secondary administrative office, I discovered a misplaced municipal notice regarding a prime 20-acre parcel of riverfront real estate, the very deep-water port terminal that had originally served as the crown jewel of my father's business. The tax document listed the current owner not as Vance Maritime Global, but as an obscure, private corporate entity named Northridge Holdings, incorporated in the state of Delaware. Intrigued and mildly confused, I used my background in corporate law to perform a discreet public records search through the Delaware Secretary of State database. What I discovered raised immediate, chilling red flags. Northridge Holdings had been officially established exactly 6 weeks before the catastrophic, unexplained cargo theft that destroyed my father's company. Even more alarming, the sole managing member listed on the original corporate filings was a private offshore trust managed exclusively by Victoria Vance. My heart heavy with a strange, sickening suspicion, I began observing my husband and mother-in-law with intense, hyper-vigilant scrutiny. I noticed how Andrew kept a secondary, encrypted mobile phone locked inside his leather briefcase, receiving quiet text notifications at strange hours of the night. I observed the subtle, anxious eye contact exchanged between Andrew and Victoria whenever quarterly corporate earnings or port expansion permits were discussed over dinner, a look not of familial warmth, but of 2 tense co-conspirators nervously monitoring a dangerous, hidden operation. I knew right then that if I wanted to survive in this house, I had to stop being a passive spectator and start hunting for the truth. Driven by a quiet, burning determination, I knew I could no longer rely on simple public records or casual observation. I needed concrete, indisputable evidence. Using small amounts of cash pulled discreetly from my monthly household allowance over 4 long months, I hired a highly recommended, fiercely independent private investigative firm operating out of Atlanta. I instructed the lead investigator to place Northridge Holdings under absolute financial surveillance, tracing every bank account, wire transfer, property transfer deed, and corporate shell company linked to its registration number. 3 weeks later, the investigator delivered an encrypted thumb drive during a brief secretive meeting in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Sitting alone in my locked car, my hands trembling as I opened the files on my laptop, the detailed financial records made my blood run ice cold. Northridge Holdings was not merely a passive holding company created to hold my father's stolen riverfront port terminals. It was functioning as a massive offshore financial conduit. Every single quarter, millions of dollars were systematically siphoned out of Vance Maritime Global's main operational accounts, routed through Northridge Holdings, and then wired directly to an international banking account held by an exclusive, highly restrictive private psychiatric and medical facility located in the isolated Alpine foothills outside Zurich, Switzerland. The recurring monthly wire transfers were classified under a specialized, highly confidential medical retainer fee for an anonymous patient registered under the internal code name Patient 7. The timeline disclosed in those banking statements sent a violent shudder down my spine. The heavy monthly wire transfers to the Swiss facility had commenced 7 years ago, during the exact same month and week that Harrison Vance had supposedly fallen to his death during a solo winter hiking trip in the treacherous Aspen Mountains. Harrison had been the brilliant, meticulously organized eldest son of the Vance family. Unlike Andrew, who was regarded by the corporate board as a charming but irresponsible playboy who relied entirely on family influence, Harrison was a visionary corporate leader. At the age of 32, Harrison held 80% of the primary voting shares in Vance Maritime Global, holding absolute executive authority over the family fortune and dictating the future direction of the entire conglomerate. Harrison ran the company with an unyielding commitment to corporate ethics, routinely blocking Andrew's reckless, highly speculative offshore investment schemes and refusing to grant his brother unrestricted access to the family trust funds. 7 years ago, the entire state had mourned when search teams spent 2 grueling weeks searching the snow-covered Aspen ravines for Harrison, eventually recovering only a torn, blood-stained winter parka and smashed satellite equipment near the edge of a 300-foot cliff. Local law enforcement had officially declared Harrison deceased due to severe weather exposure and fatal trauma, closing the case. Andrew had wept publicly at his brother's memorial service, promising their grieving mother, Victoria, that he would step up, take the reins of the corporation, and protect the sacred family legacy at all costs. Sitting in my car, staring at the Swiss bank wire records detailing 7 years of uninterrupted, highly confidential medical payments, the horrific, undeniable reality finally crystallized in my mind. Harrison had never died in those mountains. Andrew and Victoria had orchestrated his disappearance, transported him across international borders, locked him away in an isolated European clinic under a false identity, and used forged power of attorney documents to usurp his majority voting shares and take total control of the multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. A nauseating wave of horror washed over me as my mind replayed the events of the past 8 years. If Andrew and Victoria were capable of drugging, kidnapping, and permanently erasing their own eldest son and brother, simply to gain control of his corporate voting shares, what had they actually done to my father 8 years ago? I realized with absolute certainty that the catastrophic cargo theft that destroyed my father's logistics company was not a random misfortune, nor was it a failure of security. It was a cold, calculated, manufactured execution designed to push my father into financial ruin, induce a fatal health crisis, and force me into surrendering our invaluable deep-water port licenses directly into their waiting hands. Andrew had never loved me. He had never saved me. He had targeted me, manipulated my grief, and married me simply to secure a permanent, unquestioned grip on my father's stolen legacy, while keeping me silenced under his complete emotional control. Emotional. I closed my laptop, rested my forehead against the steering wheel, and took deep, slow breaths until the violent trembling in my hands stopped. I knew that I was standing on the edge of a terrifying abyss, I was living under the exact same roof as two cold-blooded monsters who had erased anyone who stood between them and absolute power. If I made a single mistake, if I allowed even a flicker of suspicion to show in my eyes, or if they discovered that I was investigating their financial accounts, I would not just be divorced. I would vanish just as quietly and permanently as Harrison had 7 years ago. I forced myself to play the long game. For the next 2 months, I amplified my role as the meek, subservient, and slightly distracted wife. I organized elaborate dinner parties for Andrew's high-profile political donors, smiled warmly whenever Victoria criticized my choice of wardrobe, and let Andrew believe I was growing increasingly forgetful and tired. I left subtle hints of emotional fatigue around the house, ensuring they believed I was becoming too fragile to pay attention to anything beyond household chores. My patience was finally rewarded 2 hours before our high-profile 10-year wedding anniversary dinner. Andrew received an urgent, unexpected phone call from the Municipal Port Authority regarding an emergency zoning dispute, forcing him to rush out of the house in a hurry. In his haste, he left his personal leather briefcase unlocked on the massive mahogany desk inside our locked private study. Knowing I had only a narrow window of time before he returned, I slipped into the study, locked the heavy double oak doors from the inside, and opened the briefcase. My fingers flew through the leather compartments, bypassing routine corporate financial reports, until I located a hidden compartment built into the rear lining. Inside was a set of heavy brass keys and a small piece of paper containing a 6-digit combination code. My eyes turned immediately toward the massive gilded oil painting of the original Vance merchant vessel hanging on the far wall. I stepped over, swung the heavy frame aside on its hidden hinges, and revealed the heavy steel wall, safe concealed behind the plaster. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I entered the combination code, inserted the key, and turned the brass wheel. With a soft mechanical click, the heavy steel door swung open. Inside the safe were stacks of unrecorded offshore bearer bonds, confidential land deeds, and 3 thick black leather-bound binders marked with Victoria Vance's distinct handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I pulled the binders out, laid them flat on the desk, and began photographing every single page using an untraceable prepaid mobile phone I had purchased with cash weeks prior. What was written on those pages was far more monstrous than anything I had imagined. The first binder contained the original internal memos, wire transfer receipts, and recorded communications detailing the deliberate sabotage of my father's shipping firm 8 years ago. Andrew had personally paid a corrupt Port Authority official $200,000 to alter our manifest logs and divert our high-value industrial cargo off the docks, deliberately orchestrating our default to trigger our financial collapse. They had engineered my father's fatal stroke, destroyed his life's work, and then stepped in as benevolent saviors to buy our priceless port terminal licenses for a fraction of their true market value through Northridge Holdings. The second binder held the complete medical incarceration files from the private Swiss clinic. Harrison had not fallen off a cliff. He had been ambushed at his remote Aspen cabin by 2 private security contractors hired by Victoria, heavily sedated with paralytic drugs, and flown out of the country on a private cargo transport plane owned by Vance Maritime Global. The clinic was being paid $600,000 annually to keep Harrison continuously sedated, isolated in a high-security wing, under the name Patient 7, and completely cut off from legal representation, while Andrew signed corporate resolutions using forged power of attorney documents. The final document inside the safe was the ultimate catalyst. It was a master consolidation contract drafted by Andrew's personal corporate attorneys, scheduled to be formally executed in 3 days during the annual shareholders meeting. The contract stipulated the permanent liquidation of Harrison's remaining trust assets and the complete absorption of all Northridge Holdings properties, including my father's riverfront port terminals, directly into Andrew's personal, unchallengeable portfolio. As I carefully returned the binders to the safe, locked the steel door, swung the painting back into place, and restored the briefcase to its exact original position, a cold, razor-sharp clarity washed over me. The naive, terrified woman who had spent 8 years bowing her head to Victoria's snobbery and believing in Andrew's fake nobility died in that study. In her place stood a woman fueled by absolute, unyielding resolve. I was done being a victim. I was done being a silent prop in their twisted theater performance. When Andrew returned home an hour later to dress for our anniversary gala, stepping into our bedroom with a charming smile and fastening a diamond necklace around my neck, I looked at his reflection in the mirror and felt no fear whatsoever. 2 hours later, as he raised his glass before 50 of the state's most influential political and business leaders to toast our flawless 10-year marriage, I looked him dead in the eyes and called him Harrison. The terrifying game had officially begun, and I was going to ensure that neither Andrew nor Victoria survived the fallout. The double doors of the private study slammed shut with a heavy, echoing thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Andrew immediately turned the brass lock, his face flushed with a dark, suffocating rage that I had never seen in our 10 years of marriage. The charming, refined, executive facade he wore for the public had completely evaporated, revealing the volatile, cruel creature hiding underneath. He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arms in a violent, bone-crushing grip that pulled me off my feet. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic as he shook me, demanding to know what kind of sick, manipulative game I was playing in front of his board members and political allies. He spat out every word, accusing me of trying to humiliate him, destroy his authority, and sabotage the most important financial deal of his life. He tightened his grip until sharp pain shot down my shoulders, whispering viciously into my face that if I ever uttered his brother's name again, he would personally ensure I was declared mentally incompetent and committed to a restricted psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life. Before I could answer, the double doors clicked open and Victoria slipped inside, closing them softly behind her. Her face was as pale as marble, her lips drawn into a tight, bloodless line. She did not look at her son. Her cold, reptilian eyes were locked entirely on me. She stepped forward, her voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that dripped with lethal intent. She instructed Andrew to let go of me, warning him that leaving visible bruises would only complicate matters if my mental stability had to be questioned legally. Andrew released me with a harsh shove, sending me stumbling back against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. Victoria stepped into my personal space, her presence imposing and cold despite her small frame. She stared down at me with utter disdain, telling me softly that penniless girls picked up from the gutter should remember who gave them a roof over their head. She reminded me that fragile, unstable women who made public scenes often suffered very tragic, irreversible accidents, advising me in a bone-chilling tone to spend the weekend resting in my quarters before I said something that would permanently end my comfortable life. I forced my shoulders to hunch, let my knees tremble, and squeezed genuine tears from my eyes. I looked between Andrew and Victoria with wide, terrified eyes, letting my voice shake violently as I stuttered out a desperate, pathetic apology. I blamed the slip of the tongue on severe emotional exhaustion, sleepless nights, and the crushing stress of managing the anniversary gala. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing quietly and begging them to forgive me, acting precisely like a broken, fragile woman who was losing her grip on reality. I watched through my fingers as Andrew exchanged a quick, arrogant look with his mother. The tension in Andrew's posture melted away instantly, replaced by a smirking, triumphant condescension. He believed my performance completely. To a narcissist like Andrew, the idea that his quiet, dependent wife was losing her mind was far more believable than the idea that she had uncovered his darkest crimes. Victoria gave a dismissive, disgusted nod, telling me to go upstairs to bed and remain there until the house staff was dismissed the following morning. I meekly nodded, wiping my cheeks, and fled the study with my head bowed. But as I closed my bedroom door behind me and locked it from the inside, the tears vanished instantly. My breathing leveled out, my posture straightened, and a cold, ruthless calm settled over my heart. They believed I was a broken bird cowering in a cage, completely unaware that I had just successfully planted the exact seed of arrogance that would blind them to the trap I was laying. The following morning, the second Andrew's sports car cleared the main gates of the estate, heading toward corporate headquarters. I went to work. I dressed in a sharp, nondescript dark suit, retrieved my untraceable prepaid mobile phone from its hiding spot beneath the lining of my jewelry box, and left the estate through the service entrance. I drove straight to the historic legal district in downtown Savannah, pulling into the private parking garage of a towering glass building. My destination was the law firm of Reynolds, Vance & Associates, specifically the corner office of Marcus Reynolds. Marcus was a legendary, fiercely feared corporate litigation attorney who had built his career on taking down corrupt conglomerates. More importantly, Marcus had been my late father's closest personal friend and legal counsel before the Vance family forced our business into insolvency, When my father suffered his stroke, Andrew's legal team had used aggressive procedural maneuvers to isolate my father from Marcus, preventing him from intervening. When I stepped into Marcus's office without an appointment, the silver-haired veteran attorney stood up from his desk in surprise. His expression was cautious, knowing the complex web of non-disclosure agreements Andrew had forced me to sign over the years. I did not waste time with small talk. I stepped up to his desk, pulled the prepaid mobile phone from my handbag, and laid it flat on the leather blotter alongside a flash drive containing the high-resolution photographs of every single document I had pulled from Andrew's hidden safe. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, noting the absolute, unwavering clarity in my eyes. He sat back down, plugged the drive into his encrypted computer terminal, and began reviewing the files. For 2 hours, the room was dead silent except for the clicking of Marcus's mouse and the rhythmic hum of the air conditioner. I watched his face shift from professional curiosity to profound shock, then to dark, burning rage as he scrolled through the evidence. He examined the receipts of the manufactured cargo theft that destroyed my father, the forged power of attorney forms transferring our riverfront port terminal licenses to Northridge Holdings, the offshore wire transfers, and the horrifying medical incarceration records detailing Harrison's 7 years of forced sedation in Zurich. When Marcus finally looked up from his screen, his hands were trembling slightly with suppressed anger. He looked at me with a profound, newfound respect that brought a lump to my throat. He stated with absolute legal authority that the evidence on the screen was not merely enough to grant me a divorce or restore my father's assets. It was a devastating, explosive dossier capable of triggering a joint federal prosecution involving the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Interpol. However, Marcus immediately laid out the dangerous reality of our situation. If we filed a standard lawsuit or alerted local authorities prematurely, Andrew's high-priced legal team would instantly file emergency protective injunctions, move his liquid assets into untraceable Caribbean shell accounts, and potentially transfer Harrison from the Zurich facility to an undisclosed location before European authorities could intervene. Andrew held immense political sway in the state, and a premature move would allow him to cover his tracks and eliminate the physical evidence. We needed absolute surgical precision. We needed to strike at the exact moment Andrew felt most invincible, during the annual corporate shareholders meeting scheduled in precisely 3 days. That was the day Andrew intended to sign the final master transfer deed, permanently consolidating Harrison's majority voting shares and my father's stolen port terminals into his personal, unchallengeable corporate portfolio. Over the next 72 hours, Marcus and his elite legal team worked in total secrecy around the clock, while I returned to the Vance estate to play the part of the distracted, obedient wife, softly humming in the garden. Taking long naps and enduring Victoria's icy glances, Marcus was executing a masterclass in international legal coordination. Using the documented medical records, Harrison's verified dental files from his youth, and high-resolution photographs provided by a Swiss private investigator Marcus hired on the spot, an emergency ex parte petition was submitted directly to a high court magistrate in the canton of Zurich. Simultaneous filings were quietly submitted under seal to the United States federal court, requesting emergency international arrest warrants and asset freezing orders based on corporate fraud, grand larceny, and human trafficking. On Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours before the shareholders' meeting, my prepaid phone chimed with a single encrypted text from Marcus. The magistrate in Zurich had signed the emergency order. Armed Swiss federal agents and legal oversight officers had executed a surprise inspection of the mountain facility outside Zurich. They had successfully located patient 7, confirmed his legal identity as Harrison Vance, and removed him from the facility under heavy armed escort. Harrison was currently safe in a secure medical wing at the United States Embassy in Bern, receiving immediate treatment to clear his system of the heavy sedatives he had been forced to take for 7 long years. He was conscious, fully coherent, and ready to reclaim his life. That night, as I lay in bed beside Andrew, listening to his steady, rhythmic breathing, I felt no fear, no anxiety, and no hesitation. The countdown had reached its final hours. The men and women who had destroyed my father, erased a brother, and spent 8 years treating me like an insignificant pawn were about to walk directly into the guillotine they had built with their own greedy hands. On Friday morning, the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters of Vance Maritime Global was electric. The towering glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Savannah was swarming with high-ranking shareholders, international investors, port directors, and national media representatives. Andrew had invited news crews from every major financial network to broadcast what he had arrogantly advertised as a historic corporate consolidation. To the day he would permanently absorb all subsidiary holdings, including my father's stolen port licenses and Harrison's remaining trust, directly into his personal empire. I arrived at the headquarters precisely 30 minutes before the ceremony, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit, my hair drawn back in a sleek, immaculate knot. In my right hand, I carried a slim leather briefcase holding 3 certified legal binders provided by Marcus Reynolds. As I stepped out of the private elevator onto the top-floor executive suite, camera flashes flared, and corporate board members nodded to me with polite, patronizing smiles. They still viewed me as the quiet, decorative wife who knew nothing of the vast financial machinery surrounding her. I walked directly into the grand auditorium, passing rows of seated executives, and took a seat near the aisle alongside Marcus Reynolds and his senior legal team. Andrew stood near the front podium in a bespoke dark suit, laughing casually with state politicians while adjusting his microphone. Victoria sat prominently in the front row, wrapped in an elegant silk blazer, her chin held high with unbearable arrogance, as she looked over her shoulder to give me a subtle, cold nod of dismissal. At exactly 10 o'clock, Andrew stepped up to the mahogany podium. He flashed his practiced, charismatic smile before the flashing cameras, delivering a moving, eloquent speech about family legacy, corporate vision, and honoring the memory of his late brother, Harrison. He spoke of expanding the conglomerate's reach along the entire eastern seaboard, grandly pointing to the massive high-definition digital display behind him, which showcased the master consolidation deed awaiting his digital signature. With practiced drama, Andrew uncapped a silver fountain pen, leaning over the podium to sign the master deed that would seal his absolute control over billions of dollars in stolen assets. I stood up from my seat, my voice echoing across the cavernous room with cold, piercing clarity, instructing him to put the pen down immediately. The entire auditorium froze. The hum of quiet conversation dissolved into an instant, suffocating silence. Dozens of media cameras swiveled away from the stage, their lenses focusing directly on me as I stepped smoothly out into the center aisle. Andrew's charming expression shattered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom, his jaw clenching as he attempted to laugh off the interruption to the audience. He turned toward the private security detail stationed near the doors, loudly declaring that his wife was suffering from a severe, sudden emotional breakdown and demanding that they escort me out of the building at once. Before the security guards could take a single step toward me, Marcus Reynolds stood up beside me, producing a certified federal court injunction signed by a judge of the United States District Court. Marcus's voice rang out with absolute authority as he announced that all voting power, corporate assets, and executive privileges held by Andrew Vance and Vance Maritime Global were officially frozen under federal authority. 24 armed agents from the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped through the main doors, taking immediate control of the room's exit points. Panic rippled through the audience. Board members gasped, shareholders leaped to their feet in confusion, and reporters frantically shouted questions as news cameras captured every second live on television. Andrew slammed his fists onto the podium, screaming for his corporate legal team to intervene, but his attorneys remained frozen in their seats, staring in horror at the official federal warrants. Before Andrew could take another breath, the giant digital display behind him went completely dark. A second later, the screen flickered back to life, establishing an ultra-high-definition live video transmission originating directly from the United States Embassy in Bern, Switzerland. Sitting at a conference table flanked by international prosecutors and federal agents was Harrison Vance. Though thin and pale from 7 years of forced isolation, Harrison's posture was rigid, his deep blue eyes burning with intense, razor-sharp authority. The room gasped in collective utter terror. Victoria let out a choked, horrific cry, her face draining of all color as she gripped the armrests of her chair, staring at her eldest son as if seeing a ghost returning from the grave. Harrison looked directly into the camera, addressing the board of directors and the media by name. In a clear, unwavering voice, he formally declared that he was alive, fully coherent, and standing on legal ground as the majority voting shareholder of Vance Maritime Global. He detailed his abduction, his 7 years of forced medical sedation in Zurich, and the forged powers of attorney used by his brother. He formally revoked every contract, merger, and legal agreement signed by Andrew over the past 7 years, declaring them completely fraudulent and legally void. The auditorium erupted into absolute chaos. Shareholders shouted in anger. Corporate directors backed away from Andrew as if he were poisonous, and reporters shoved microphones toward the stage. Andrew turned toward his mother with a wild, hyperventilating panic in his eyes, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an escape that no longer existed. I walked slowly down the center aisle toward the front of the room, stopping directly before the podium. I pulled the certified financial ledgers from my briefcase, the evidence detailing the deliberate sabotage of my father's business, and handed them directly to the lead federal agent standing beside Andrew. I looked my husband dead in the eyes, telling him that the port licenses he had stolen from my dying father 8 years ago had just become the very evidence that would lock him away for the rest of his life. The lead agent stepped behind Andrew, grabbing his wrists, pulling his arms behind his back, and snapping heavy steel handcuffs into place. Andrew frantically shouted for his mother, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation, as he was marched past his former corporate peers, through the gauntlet of flashing news cameras, and out of the building in full view of the world. Victoria collapsed back into her velvet seat, weeping hysterically as federal agents served her with formal indictments for human trafficking, corporate conspiracy, and grand larceny. Standing in the middle of that roaring, chaotic room as the multi-billion-dollar empire built on blood and lies crumbled into ash, I felt no anger, no satisfaction in their destruction, and no lingering grief. The suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for nearly a decade was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable freedom. Justice had finally arrived, and my father's name was clean once more. The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation dismantled the Vance legacy permanently. Andrew was denied bail due to the severe international nature of his crimes and was later sentenced to 35 years in a federal maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Victoria, stripped of her wealth, properties, and social standing to pay court-ordered restitution, pled guilty to avoid a public trial, spending her remaining years in a state-monitored facility. Entirely forgotten by the high society she had once ruled, Harrison returned to the United States 2 months later, fully recovering his health and taking his rightful place as chief executive officer. Together with Marcus Reynolds, Harrison legally annulled every fraudulent agreement, restoring complete ownership of the riverfront port terminals and millions of dollars in accumulated back revenues directly to my family estate. Harrison offered me an independent executive partnership, which I accepted, taking my seat on the board of directors as an equal. 4 months after that fateful day, my divorce was finalized. Standing on the sunlit docks of our Savannah port terminal, watching the massive freight ships move gracefully along the water, with my family's name painted proudly on the hulls, I finally breathed in the salt air as a truly free woman. I'd entered the Vance world as a helpless victim, but I walked away as the author of my own destiny. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Thank you for watching.